Yeah, let me get the audio going and then we can get started. So that we know we're working on a new platform, given the quality of the audio in the past. The study that we had last week, the audio was really bad. It was skipping quite a bit. So I decided, we'll try to go over the study again tonight, and then Lord willing, depending on how things go here on Power Talk, I'm sorry, on Messenger. We're working off of Messenger right now, so we'll give that a shot and see how it goes. The name of the study, Suffering Loss. We talked about it last time. Okay, there it is. Suffering loss unto judgment, church given over to Babylon, embracing false gospels. So what I'm proposing here is simply the fact that, when the Bible speaks of suffering loss, on the judgment side, we're thinking of those who end up under God's judgment. And 1 Corinthians 3, verse 13, every man's work shall be made manifest. Margaret, I guess you can either text or maybe say something. How's the audio? I'm sure it should be better compared to Pal Talk.
Right, here you go. Here you go, honey.
Yeah, I can hear.
We're starting a new platform we're going to start instead of going on.
All right, so we're looking at 1 Corinthians 3, verse 13. Every man's work shall be made manifest, for the day shall declare it, because it shall be revealed by fire, and the fire shall try every man's work of what sort it is. And then in verse 15, if any man's work shall be burned, he shall suffer loss, but himself shall be saved, yet so as by fire. So in this verse also we talked about some time ago, that seems to be looking at the judgment, as I said, that comes on Babylon after the tribulation. So the idea of suffering loss appears to be focusing primarily on the judgment that comes on Babylon in the end. Let me copy and try and paste this verse here. Okay, and I would appreciate you guys, if you do have a question, you can, I'm not sure, I think there is an icon where you can raise your hand if you wanted to say something, but I don't think we need to do that. But as we're going through the verses, we'll try to keep the audio down, and then if you have a specific question related to the study, because we are recording this session, then you can simply say, hey, I'd like to say something, and then, get our attention that way. Now, in John, let's see. All right, so what I was saying is 1 Corinthians 3, verse 15, if any man's work shall be burned, he shall suffer loss, but himself shall be saved, yet so as by fire. John 6:39, this is the Father's will which hath sent me, that of all that he hath given me I should lose nothing, but should raise it up again at the last day. 2 John 1:8, look to yourselves that we lose not those things which we have wrought, but that we receive a full reward. Amos chapter 4. Also what I can do is, rather than posting each verse at a time, we can just go through the verses, and at the end of the study, I can post as many verses as I can on the screen, and those verses are going to be there even after the study for anyone to look at. 2 John 1:8, look to yourselves that we lose not those things which we have wrought. Amos 4, verse 11, I have overthrown some of you as God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah, and ye were as a firebrand plucked out of the burning, yet have ye not returned unto me, saith the Lord. Philippians 3, verse 13, brethren, I count not myself to have apprehended, but this thing I do know, this one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind, and reaching forth unto those things which are before. Okay, so again, the context, everything we're looking at here seems to be pointing to God's judgment on the church, which was typified by the burning in Sodom and Gomorrah. But interestingly enough, here we read about Lot's wife looking back. Genesis 19, verse 26. But his wife looked back from behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. Now this would be equivalent to suffering loss. Does that make sense? suffering loss. So the judgment that came on Lot's wife would be the church suffering loss, the church looking back. John 9 verse 41, Jesus said unto them, If ye were blind, ye should have no sin. But now ye say, We see, therefore your sin remaineth. So this last verse, John 9 verse 41, I think it's going to lead us to the next section, where those that profess to be blind, they are giving of themselves. They are turning away from Babylon, and therefore they end up seeing. But those who say we see are the ones that are insisting, no, no, we have Christ. Remember the verse that says, Many shall come in my name, saying, I am, and shall deceive many. Okay, so keep that in mind when we think about John 9 verse 41. If ye were blind, ye should have no sin, but now ye say we see, therefore your sin remaineth. Okay, so these are some of the verses, again, on the judgment side. We're talking about suffering loss. And the target verse here on the judgment side is 1 Corinthians 3, verses 13 to 15. Now let's move into, let's look at another aspect of suffering loss, which picks up on what I was just talking about. And let me try and paste that, the salvation side. Suffering loss unto salvation. The church losing life to gain Christ. Remember we talked about this at length at one time. Those identified first with Babylon. Remember the wheat and tares are growing together. The church identifies with Babylon in tribulation, then giving up false gospel. So they lose their life. They lose Christ that would have been anti-Christ in tribulation. Does that make sense? So the church loses its life in order to gain Christ. Philippians chapter 3 verse 8. Yea, doubtless I count all things but loss for the excellency of the knowledge of Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things. Now it doesn't say here, it's not talking about Paul having not being saved. We know that he was a saved individual. But the idea of suffering loss, giving up all things for the knowledge of and the excellency of Christ, means that it is pointing to the believers, I think, coming out of tribulation. And then in Matthew 16 verse 25, for whosoever will save his life shall lose it. See that? Let me post this verse also. This is not a long study. I'll just finish up with a few verses and then we'll open the room for discussion. Matthew 16 verse 25, for whosoever will save his life shall lose it, and whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it. So that picks up on what I was saying a little bit earlier. That picks up on John 9 verse 41. Jesus said unto them, If ye were blind, ye should have no sin. But now ye say, We see, therefore your sin remaineth. Can you see the connection? That connects, it looks at those that are saying, we see, we see. So they are saving their life. So whosoever will save his life shall lose it, and whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it. Matthew 10 verse 39, he that findeth his life shall lose it, and he that loseth his life for my sake shall find it. Let me post that verse also. Yeah, so I've got Matthew 10 verse 39. John 12 verse 25. He that loveth his life shall lose it, and he that hateth his life in this world shall keep it unto life eternal. Acts chapter 20 verse 24. But none of those things move me, neither count I my life dear unto myself, so that I might finish my course with joy. Alright, so I'm looking at Revelation chapter 12 verse 11. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb, and by the word of their testimony, and they loved not their lives unto death. Same idea. Now, they loved not their lives. Okay, so now let's look at Revelation 8 verse 18. For I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. The suffering, remember those who suffer loss, the believers, they had to go through the great tribulation. And that's how they give up their life, right? They give up their life and they come out of Babylon. Those who love not their lives unto death. Job 1 verse 20. Then Job arose and rent his mantle and shaved his head and fell down upon the ground and worshipped. Verse 21. And he said, Naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. The idea of God taking away. Okay, God took away the riches that he had. What are those riches pointing to, if I might ask? The physical riches that Job possessed. Any thoughts on that? Job had riches, and God took those riches away from him. And now so from that regard, from that respect, he lost his life, right? And Job 122, and all this Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. Job 42 verse 10, and the Lord turned the captivity of Job when he prayed for his friends. Also the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Now this latter part of the verse, I think, is pointing to the redemption of the church. Now that he lost what he had, that's what happens to the believers coming into the Great Tribulation. They suffer loss, and it's because of the chastisement, that also referred to as chastisement, God was able to bring them through the fire. So it was necessary that the church endure temptation, endure tribulation, to suffer loss, so that they, like Job, would end up owning twice as much. In other words, they have Christ. So they forsake their lives, they give up their lives. They're not fighting to save their lives. And in losing their lives, suffering loss, they end up gaining Christ. So let me read that verse again, looking at the salvation part of this. In Philippians chapter 3 verse 8, Yea, doubtless I count all things but loss for the excellency of the knowledge of Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things, and do count them but dung, that I may win Christ. For whosoever will save his life shall lose it, and whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it. Okay, now like I said, I'll go ahead and post those verses a little bit later on. But I have a very short conclusion here. Let me put that on the screen. Summary conclusion. When it comes to the language of suffering loss, God appears to be focusing on the judgment that comes on Babylon. Okay, so that's the judgment side, as well as the elect forsaking Babylon in order to gain Christ. In other words, they lose their lives. They're not holding on to their lives, which becomes antichrist and tribulation. Okay, but rather in losing their lives, they gain Christ. So they suffer, they lose all things in order to gain Christ. All right, let me stop the recorder, and then we can open for a discussion.